There is a man on his hands and knees in the Burma mud, and nothing has shot him. His body is burning with fever, his boots are full of leeches. He has not eaten a real meal in longer than he can remember, and the water he drank this morning is already turning on him. Somewhere up ahead, the column is still moving, and the order coming back down the line is the same order as yesterday and the day before that. Get up. Keep walking. He is an American volunteer, thousands of miles from home, in a place most people back home could not have found on a map. He signed up for a mission the Army would only describe as dangerous and hazardous. He did not know it would mean this. Almost none of them did. This is the story of the men who were sent into the worst ground of the war and told to hold on. And it is the story of what happened when the people who sent them there decided they were not finished yet. In the fall of 1943, a call went out through the American Army for volunteers. The wording was deliberately vague. A dangerous and hazardous mission. No location, no details, and no promises, except one that would come to matter more than anyone understood at the time. They were told it would be hard, and they were told it would end. Do this one job and you would be sent home. About 3,000 men raised their hands. They were not a polished outfit. Some were combat veterans pulled out of the South Pacific, men who had already been through Guadalcanal and the island fighting and knew exactly what they were volunteering for. Others were what the Army politely called casuals, discipline cases, men their old units were glad to hand over. They came together in India under a quiet, driven officer named Frank Merrill, and they were given a code name that sounded like it came out of a storybook. Galahad. A war correspondent would soon give them a better name, borrowed from their commander. Merrill's Marauders. They were built into 3 battalions, and each battalion was split again into 2 self-contained combat teams. 6 of them in all, and somebody with a tidy mind gave the teams colors instead of numbers. Red and white, blue and green, orange and khaki. A few thousand men, a few hundred mules, and a plan that depended on every one of them staying alive far past the point where staying alive was a reasonable thing to expect. On paper, they were the 5,307th Composite Unit Provisional. In practice, they were an experiment. The Army wanted to know whether American soldiers could do the thing a British officer named Wingate had gambled on before them. Walk deep behind the Japanese lines, on foot, and fight there, cut off from everything, supplied by nothing but what could be pushed out of an airplane and dropped down to them through the trees. In February of 1944, they walked into Burma. Understand what that meant? There were no trucks, there were no roads worth the name, only trails hacked through some of the thickest jungle on the planet. Everything a man could not carry on his own back was carried by mules, hundreds of them, stepping along cliff trails and swimming the rivers. Their whole lifeline ran through the sky. When the weather closed in and the transport planes could not fly, they did not eat. They were not entirely alone out there. The hills of northern Burma belonged to a people called the Kachin, who had no love at all for the Japanese occupying their homeland, and a small handful of American officers from an outfit called Detachment 101 had been living among them, arming them, fighting alongside them. It was the Kachin who scouted the trail ahead, who knew which ridge hid what, who slipped wounded men back out of the jungle. Without them, the Marauders would have been blind. With them, they were only outnumbered. Before it was over, these men would march farther on foot, and deeper into country the enemy believed was his own, than almost any American unit of the entire war. Hundreds of miles of it, and a mountain range at the end, walked on feet that were rotting inside their boots. They walked it because there was no other way to reach the places they were being sent, and there was never any question of not reaching them. Waiting ahead of them was the Japanese 18th Division. These were not second-line troops. The 18th were the men who had taken Singapore, hardened jungle fighters who thought of this ground as theirs. The job the Marauders had been given was to slip in behind them, cut the roads that fed them, and hit them from the one direction they were not watching. And the country itself was trying to kill every man walking through it. The monsoon turned the trails to grease. The leeches came up out of the soaked ground and found their way into everything. Men went down with malaria, and then with something worse, a typhus carried by mites the size of a pinhead that lived in the brush, and it put a man flat on his back and shaking, and it did not care in the slightest how brave he was. Amoebic dysentery moved through the ranks and hollowed men out from the inside. They were living on K rations, a few waxed boxes a day built for short bursts of combat, never meant to carry a man through months of marching. They were starving a little more every week, and there was no rotation. No few days pulled off the line, no hot food, no dry cot, no relief, and no end a man could mark on a calendar. Just the next ridge, and the ridge after that. Everything they had came out of the sky, and there was never quite enough of it. On a good day, the transport planes came in low over a clearing, and men called kickers shoved the bundles out through the open door, and parachutes bloomed and snagged in the tops of the trees, and the Marauders went and cut them down. On a bad day, the clouds sat down on the mountains, and nothing flew at all. And from the ground, a good day and a bad day could look exactly the same until the drop did or did not come. They learned to ration a thing that was already a ration. And here is the thing that should never get lost underneath all of it. They won. In early March, at a place called Walawbum, the Marauders got in behind the 18th Division and fought it out in the open, and they held their ground. In the weeks that came after, at Shaduzup and Inkangatong, and a dozen other places nobody at home would ever hear of, this starving, fever-ridden, outnumbered force met one of the best jungle divisions in the Japanese army over and over again. By the army's own count, 5 major engagements and 30 smaller ones. And not once were they driven from the field. They were doing exactly what they had been asked to do. Hold on to that, because it is what makes the rest of this so hard to sit with. The way they fought was almost simple to say and almost impossible to do. Instead of hitting the Japanese head-on, they would swing wide off the trail, march for days around the enemy's flank, and set a roadblock down across the road behind him, across the supply line that was feeding him, so that now he had to turn around and come attack them just to breathe. It meant they were nearly always outnumbered. It meant they were nearly always the ones being charged, fighting with a river or a ridge at their backs, and no clean way out. It worked. It kept working. And every single time it worked, it cost them men they had no way to replace, because there were no replacements coming. There was never going to be anyone else. There was only ever them. At the end of March, one of the 3 battalions was cut off on a dry, dusty hill called Nhpum Ga. For nearly 2 weeks, the Japanese surrounded them and tried to squeeze the life out of the position. First, they killed the mules. Then they took the water hole. And that was worse, because a man in that heat can go hungry far longer than he can go without water. The wounded piled up with nowhere to send them, and the dead could not be buried, because to bury a man meant standing up under fire. So the dead stayed where they had fallen, out in the open, in the sun, for days. The men who lived through it gave the hill the only name that fit what it had become: Maggot Hill. The other 2 battalions spent those same days trying to fight their way through to them, ridge by ridge, and could not break through fast enough. What kept the men on the hill alive at all was the same thin lifeline as everything else. Planes came over the surrounded position and dropped water down to them in whatever would carry it, because the one thing that could not be done was to carry it up the trail by hand. It was on that hill that a soldier named Roy Matsumoto did the thing that saved what was left of the battalion. Matsumoto was a Nisei, an American of Japanese ancestry, one of the linguists attached to the unit. At night, he crawled out toward the Japanese positions and lay there in the dark and listened to them plan their next attack, and he brought the plan back. So when the assault came in, the Americans were ready and waiting for it. And in the middle of the fight, Matsumoto did one more thing. In perfect Japanese, he screamed the order to charge, and a wave of enemy soldiers stood up too early, out of cover, into a stretch of ground the Marauders had already ranged. The attack collapsed. The siege broke. The battalion held. They held everything they were ever asked to hold. Keep that in mind for what comes next. I want to say one thing here before we go on, and it is not a sales pitch. This channel exists for one reason: to keep the names of men like these from being drawn down to nothing. If somewhere back in your own family there was a man who served in a place like this, I'm going to ask you for his name at the end of this, and I mean it. Stay with me. It lands harder at the end than it would right now. By the late spring of 1944, the Marauders were finished. Not finished as in beaten. Finished as in used up. Their bodies were failing faster than any enemy could have taken them apart. Men were walking skeletons by then, held upright by quinine and habit and not much else. And every last one of them was still carrying the same thing he had carried in from the beginning. The promise. Do the job and you go home. The job was as good as done. The 18th Division had been battered and shoved back. They had earned the one thing they had been promised. And then the orders changed. There was one more objective, a town up in the north called Myitkyina, and beside it, an airfield that the whole campaign had secretly been pointing at the entire time. Take that airfield, and the great airlift that was keeping China in the war could stop flying the deadliest supply route on Earth, over the Himalayas. It was the prize of the theater, and the man in command of that theater, an American general named Joseph Stilwell, wanted it badly. The men called him Vinegar Joe, and the name was not meant kindly. Stilwell was a hard, stubborn, difficult man who had been driven out of Burma in defeat back in 1942, and had spent every day since trying to fight his way back into it. And Myitkyina had become something close to a fixed idea for him. He wanted that airfield. He wanted it taken by his own troops. And by the spring of 1944, the only troops he had left who could do it were the Marauders, whether there was anything still left in them or not. For that last push, they were sent up and over the Kuman Range, a wall of mountains 6,000 feet high, in the full weight of the monsoon. The trail up it was a ladder of mud. Mules lost their footing and went over the edge with everything strapped to them. And men stood and watched a week of food and ammunition tumble down into the gorge and could do nothing about it. Some of them were so far gone by then that they climbed with one hand flat on the mule in front of them, moving only because the column moved, not because they had decided anything. And waiting on the far side of all of it was a fight. On the 17th of May, the Marauders, or what was still standing of them, came down out of those mountains and stormed the Myitkyina airfield, and they took it in a single day. It was a remarkable feat of soldiering, carried out by men who could barely stand up straight. Taking that airfield was supposed to be the end of it. Instead, it turned out to be the start of the worst part of the whole story. The airfield fell in a day. The town did not. The town held out for 2.5 more months, and the men who had just been told they were finally going home found themselves fed into a siege instead, with no relief on the way, for the simple reason that there was almost nobody left to relieve them with. So the army did something that a lot of those men would never forgive. By now, the hospitals back in India were filling up with marauders, men with fevers that would not break, men worn down past the point of usefulness, finally pulled off the line and laid in a clean bed. And the order came down to send them back to Myitkyina. Part of it was a genuine mistake, a message garbled somewhere in transmission until it read that any man who could still walk should return to the front. But part of it was no mistake at all. Sick men were taken out of hospital beds in Assam and loaded onto planes back to the siege, over the flat objection of the doctors who were treating them. Some of them landed so ill they had to be evacuated again the same day they arrived. And Frank Merrill was not there to put a stop to any of it. He had already gone down twice himself, once with a heart attack, once with malaria. The commander of the Marauders was lying in a hospital bed of his own, while his men were being pulled out of theirs. Think about what that does to a man. Not the enemy in front of him, his own side, reaching into the one safe place it had finally allowed him and dragging him back out of it. One of them lived to write it all down, years later, in a book. Based on his account, and on the accounts of the men who were around him, the thing that broke them at the very end was not fear of the Japanese. It was the slow, sinking understanding that to the people directing them from somewhere far behind the line, they had stopped being men with a limit to what they could take and had quietly become something else. A resource, a number on a report, to be drawn down and drawn down until the account read empty. By the time Myitkyina finally fell, in August, the unit had simply come apart. Here are the numbers, and they are worth saying slowly. Roughly 3,000 men had volunteered. 2,750 of them had actually walked into Burma. And of those 2,750, by the time it was over, exactly 2 men had never once been sent to a hospital for a wound or for sickness. 272 of them were killed, 955 were wounded, and close to 1,000 more were carried out of that jungle, not by any bullet, but by disease. Far more of them were destroyed by the country than by the enemy inside it. The doctors had seen it coming for months. They had watched the same men come back through the aid stations again and again, patched up and sent forward, a little thinner every time, until at last the body had nothing left to give back. Malaria they had expected. It was the mite typhus, and the dysentery, and the plain, slow starvation piled on top of exhaustion, with no rest anywhere in the plan for it, that turned a fighting unit into a long column of sick men who happened to still be carrying rifles. On the 10th of August, 1944, 6 months after they had first walked in, the 5,307th Composite Unit was quietly dissolved. The survivors, the small numbers still on their feet, were folded into another regiment, and the name on the paperwork disappeared. At the very end, the count of men still fit to fight, out of the 3,000 who had raised their hands the autumn before, was somewhere around 130. When word of the hospital evacuations got back out, it caused enough anger that the army eventually had to look into how sick men had been ordered back up into the line, and the doctors who had objected were, in the end, proven right about what it had cost them. The name Merrill's Marauders was gone. But the war did not stop needing men, and so a new and larger force was stood up to carry the fight on into the next campaign. And some of the survivors, hard as it is to believe, were still standing there in the ranks of it. They had handed the army its airfield. The Army handed them a fresh unit number and turned them back toward the map. Here is what I keep coming back to. The Japanese 18th Division never broke the Marauders. Nobody on the other side of that war ever did. In 6 months of the hardest fighting in the hardest place it could be done, they were not beaten in the field. Not once. What finished them was not the enemy. It was a decision, made behind them by their own command, that men who had already given everything they had still had a little more in them to give, and then a little more after that, until the unit was not a unit anymore. It was a casualty list with a few survivors attached to the bottom of it. They were not defeated. They were spent. There is a difference between those two words, and the men who lived it understood the difference in their bones. The Army did, in time, say thank you. Every man who served in the Marauders was given the Bronze Star. The unit received a Distinguished Unit Citation, and their bloodline did not die when the name did. The regiment they were folded into carried the lineage forward, and it runs, in a straight line, right into the 75th Ranger Regiment, some of the hardest and most respected soldiers this country has today. In 2020, 76 years after Burma, Congress voted the Marauders its gold medal. By the time it did, only a small handful of them were still alive to hold it. But a medal placed in the hands of an old man in a quiet room is a strange sort of settling of accounts. It does not reach back to the hill, or to the trail, or to the hospital bed a man was carried out of against a doctor's word. It cannot give back what was already spent. So I am not going to end this by telling you these men were forgotten, because that is the easy version, and it lets the rest of us off the hook. They were not lost by some accident of memory. They were used, all the way to the bottom, by people who needed one more mile out of them, and then one more after that. And when there was nothing left to use, their number was folded away in a place where nobody would have to look straight at it. The least we can do all these years later is look straight at it. If there was a man in your family who served in Burma or in India or in China, in the theater that almost nobody back home could even picture, a mule handler, a radio operator, a rifleman, a pilot flying that airlift over the mountains, leave his name down below. His first name is enough, and where he served, if you happen to know it. I read every single one of them, out loud, because a name is the one thing about these men that no order can ever draw down and no campaign can ever use up.